Uh, Good evening. I'm Jim Gardner, Executive for Legislative Archives, Presidential Libraries, and Museum Services here at the National Archives. Welcome to all of you who've joined us tonight in the William G. McGowan Theater, and welcome to those of you joining us online on YouTube. We're pleased to have you all involved in tonight's program. We are very pleased to be presenting tonight's program, Why Lincoln Still Matters, in partnership with the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, and we thank them sincerely for their support. Before we go any further, for those of you who've been to the National Archives before, you know that we like to put in a few plugs for upcoming events. I believe there have been a number of programs flashed on the screen here, but I want to call your particular attention to the programs that we're going to have Wednesday through Sunday, February 24th through 28th. We will be hosting the 12th annual free screenings of the Academy Award nominees in 4 categories: documentary, feature, documentary short subject, live action short film, and animated short film. The screenings are presented by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in partnership with the Charles Guggenheim Center for Documentary Film and the National Archives Foundation. The full schedule for the Academy Award screenings is on our website, archives.gov. If you want to know more about our other programs, please refer to our monthly calendar of events. Copies of the calendar are in the lobby as you exit, along with the sign-up sheet if you would like to be included on our mailing list for the calendar, either by regular mail or email. Another way to get involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the archives, especially our education and public programs like the one tonight. There are application materials for the National Archives Foundation in the lobby, or you can become a member online at archivesfoundation.org. Again, we're very pleased to be partnering with the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia on tonight's programs. For those of you not familiar with the National Archives, we hold over 20 million records pertaining to the Lincoln years in the archives, in categories such as executive, legislative, judicial, and military, including letters, telegrams, and treaties, photographs, political cartoons, and maps pertaining to the Civil War era. In other words, this is a very good fit for us. We have a special evening ahead of us tonight, but before I turn things over to our moderator, I want to note or to remind you that there will be book signings with all the panelists in the theater lobby following the program this evening. Now it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage our distinguished panel of Lincoln scholars, Harold Holzer, Martha Hodges, Craig Symonds, and Lucas Morel.
Well, good evening and welcome. Martha Hodges and Craig Symonds, just get all the names correct. Welcome, and we're glad that you're engaging with us today on this subject of why Lincoln still matters. I know most of you are regulars at these programs, and if I took a show of hands, you'd all say Lincoln still matters, but we're going to get into the weeds tonight. So I want to start in my role as moderator by acknowledging something that will not particularly come as a newsflash to you, and that's the alert that we're in the midst of a presidential campaign. 2 campaigns, really, one for the Republican nomination and one for the Democratic nomination. No surprises that they seem to be on different tracks. What I find astonishing, and our panelists can weigh in on this, is that among the issues that the candidates on both sides have raised this year is who best represents the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. We've heard it from the Republican and the Democratic side alike, and it's not a new phenomenon. In 1912, two Republicans and one Democrat each aligned themselves with Abraham Lincoln in different ways. Woodrow Wilson visited Springfield, shocking for a Democrat. Teddy Roosevelt talked about his having seen the Lincoln funeral and wearing a ring with a lock of Lincoln's hair. And William Howard Taft went up to Vermont to receive the blessing of Lincoln's surviving son, Robert. So it's not a new phenomenon, nor for you Washingtonians will it be a surprise that all of our recent presidents have been deeply interested in Abraham Lincoln and preserving his legacy and presenting programs inciting him. And so it has gone. This year, there have been some miscues. Rand Paul said that the nation's problems often drove him to his knees in prayer, using a quote about Abraham Lincoln that's probably not true, not an accurate quote. And just a few weeks ago, Hillary Clinton introduced her economic program months ago by talking about Lincoln and his path of opportunity for all idea. But a few weeks ago, she got into something of a kerfuffle by saying that had Lincoln, her favorite president, she said, that way you don't have to choose between President Clinton and President Obama. She chose Lincoln. She said, had Lincoln lived, Reconstruction would not have been so disruptive. This unleashed quite a firestorm. Ta-Nehisi Coates, among others. We even had a candidate for president named Lincoln this year, didn't we? Do you remember the brief shining moment of Lincoln Chafee? I should have mentioned that. So we will keep politics out of it. But I did want to say that why is Lincoln back with us as an issue not as an issue so much as how can he be an ideal for these disparate sets of candidates? Let's start with Craig and move to the right.
Well, Lincoln is a national icon, and far enough back in the past that there are few ripples that would ensue from citing Lincoln as someone that you particularly admire. I think one of the things that Lincoln brings is that he was both progressive and pragmatic. So he was a pragmatic progressive or progressively pragmatic, I'm not sure which of those, but that he had a clear ideology but was flexible or pliable in the way he approached that. And it allows contemporary candidates to, not cherry pick necessarily, but to emphasize those aspects of his leadership and his presidency that they particularly support. But it's safe ground for a politician today to be an advocate of Lincoln. I think that's one reason. I think, too, that his martyrdom was certainly part of that as well, but I'm going to let Martha talk about that particularly.
Well, Martha, as some of you, I hope all of you know, just won the Lincoln Prize for her book, Mourning Lincoln. So my days as the laureate ended when Martha displaced me. So Martha, it is good that it's your turn to speak, because certainly a lot of what's refracted about Lincoln and remembered has to do with the reputational earthquake that occurred with his assassination. And you've done such brilliant work on the different responses. So I don't know if you can get to everything, but we'll weave it in and out as we continue. And of course, you speak on so many other subjects. But tell us how mourning for Lincoln perhaps transformed him into the figure that is attractive to all.
Well, we also have to remember that the assassination was the nation's first presidential assassination. So it was a truly astounding event, even though there had been rumors of other assassination attempts. When it happened, nothing like that had ever happened before. And it was really a moment unlike the assassination of the 3 other presidents in our nation who have been assassinated, because of course it came less than a week after Union victory. So it was really an astonishing moment in which people already felt they were participants in the history of the making of the nation. And then with this unprecedented event, it became even more a moment of palpable participation in the future of the nation. And although people remembered the assassination and even wrote about the assassination at the moment as a time of universal grief, in fact, it was not at all a time of universal grief. There was tremendous conflict and tension at this moment, at the end of the war, and with the assassination. And in that conflict and tension, we see so much about clashing visions of what people wanted the nation to become at the end of the Civil War. And in those visions, all sides invoked Lincoln, much the same way all sides invoke Lincoln now.
Lucas, bringing your specialty as a political scientist, might as well get that admission out of the way.
Card carrying.
Did politics change after Lincoln in terms of alignments and clutching that mantle?
Yeah, the way I look at it is, and I come at it, as you say, from the perspective of a political theorist as opposed to a historian, is it touches on what both Martha and Craig have mentioned, that Lincoln isn't our most iconic president, and it's not just because of the top hat, it's not just because of the beard, it's because of what he said. He's the most quotable president, and it's not just because he was a wordsmith, it's what those words meant. 9/11, right? What did we were struggling for words to express our remorse, our outrage. The first time we commemorated it, what did we do? We didn't quote Lincoln, we read Lincoln. The Gettysburg Address was read word for word. Why did we do that? Because we thought somehow that president, way back when, got to something at the core of what all Americans believed about their country. His ideas and the way he elaborated what American democracy, American republic meant for the people, by the people, of the people, these sorts of things. Taking us back to the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, government by consent of the governed. Lincoln was one who, while in some respects, we may get into this later, some respects a polarizing figure in his day, and even still today, was able to tap into something that was at the heart of the American people. Frederick Douglass once said, "We all know Abraham Lincoln by heart." And by that, we didn't just know him because he saved the Union. We know him and knew him by heart because of the things we memorized, the things we learned from Lincoln about, in the time of crisis, what are the things that matter? What are the most important things that stand out about this regime? Lincoln had a handle on that.
I think it's a very good point about 9/11. I'm assuming Martha was in New York at the time, and I was, of course. And I had an interesting response to the use of the Gettysburg Address. And that is that I think that no one had the audacity or daring to construct a rhetorical response. And falling back on Lincoln, I thought was odd in a way. It was a retreat. And I just think of Lincoln in terms of summoning 272 words in a crisis of that order. So I was sort of disappointed in an odd way.
I agree with you. Not to belabor that point, but I was surprised and a bit disappointed. I was like, wow, nobody in the United States, no leading public intellectual, politician, any person of note could summon up in the highest sense of the words, the word rhetoric for that day that we had to crib from our most iconic president. So yeah, I too was disappointed by that.
Another interesting point about 9/11 is that I was in New York City and I saw some of it happen, and my memory of it was a moment of universal grief. But I had also taken a walk and taken pictures of some of the signs that people had put up on the spontaneous memorials, and going back to look at them when I was writing Mourning Lincoln, I saw that it was anything but universal. There was all kinds of conflict and tension in the signs about whether we should go to war, whether we should be forgiving, whether we should not go to war. People would put up a sign, and then people would respond to that sign with terrible, awful things saying to one another. So it was that a similar kind of moment where we remember it in a way that it didn't really happen, and that was true of the assassination as well.
I think this leads to a question that I want to throw to Craig, who is our military historian. Lincoln, and that is this notion of forgiveness. Lincoln is an example of both being humane as a pardoner, but also being pretty tough on deserters, sleeping sentinels, all of the above. What is the real Lincoln here, and what is the example?
Well, you know, we talked about the Gettysburg Address just a minute ago, but probably second only to that is the phrasing that he used in the second inaugural about with malice toward none, with charity toward all, this notion of we'll heal the nation, and I think is what contributed to Secretary Clinton's reference to Reconstruction, an alternate Reconstruction, a more benign Reconstruction of some way. We can get into that later if you want. But I think it was part of Lincoln's fabric to be forgiving. You mentioned that he could be tough. He could be tough in certain circumstances, but he was very much a softie in terms of the sleeping sentinel. He wrote those forgiveness notes. Don't shoot this boy is the famous one, A. Lincoln. He did not want to take a life unnecessarily. It, I think, wounded him deeply that the war was as costly as it was. If it had been anything less than the two most important things in life to him, and that is the salvation of the democratic experiment itself and the emancipation of an entire race, the sacrifice would have completely crushed him. I think as it was, he was heavily burdened. There's a lot of conversation about whether he was manic depressive or not, but he certainly, whether he was manic depressive, he certainly had a context in which being depressed was justified, given the burden that he dealt with every day. The news would come in of another defeat at Chancellorsville, for example, and he would walk the hallways all night long. Oh my God, what will the country say? Part of that is a political response, but part of it too, I think, is an internal moral burden that he carries. So I think the idea of forgiveness was very much part of his ideology, but I mentioned the pragmatism that's part of it too. If that's the cost, and this too is from the second inaugural, if all of the blood drawn with the sword, drawn with the lash must be paid for by another drawn with a sword, then that was the price to pay for those intensely important objectives.
And God had decreed it. I mean, he flipped responsibility to God in that speech.
Well.
But you're right, that speech, I was hoping you'd get to that. There are the two sides of Lincoln. If every drop of blood, et cetera, then the judgments then the war continues. Right. But then with malice toward none, which is what we remember when it's applicable.
I have a little bit of a different interpretation of that phrase, malice toward none and charity for all, which is so important. One of the things that became clear to me when I was reading about the assassination was the way African Americans used that phrase and quoted that phrase. And that led me to see that in their minds, in the minds of African Americans at that moment, that phrase may have had less to do with Confederates than with themselves. And it was their way of claiming Lincoln as a radical who would have given them or helped them attain and seize certain kinds of rights. And part of my evidence for that is that African Americans put those words on a banner and carried them through the streets on July 4th, 1865, here in Washington, D.C. And I was quite sure after everything else I had read and having taught the Civil War for 25 years that that community was not referring to Confederates.
But we should add something on that as well. You don't get to malice toward none and charity for all without going through that very tough third paragraph, right? It's a 4-paragraph speech, 700 some odd words. That is the all-important paragraph. Lincoln doesn't claim he knows what the will of God is, right? The Almighty has his own purposes. Once he says that, then the following sentence, if we shall suppose, Lincoln conducts a thought experiment for the country to unite the country off the battlefield right? We could beat them on the battlefield. How do we win? If we win the war, how do we win the peace? And Lincoln says, we have to, as a nation, come together. How do we do it? Not just by bullets, not just by ballots, but with our memory. Lincoln draws up a public memory for the nation and says, let's try this. Perhaps, let's suppose God was doing this in this war. And interestingly enough, what does he show us? How many, every time we check, the wounded and the
numbers are
dead go
going
up.
up, yeah.
600, 700, maybe even more than 700,000. Terrible as that was, 4 years, blood, treasure sunk. But how many years did we enslave black people in this country? A quarter of a millennium. Turns out 4 years and 700,000 wouldn't be justice if God let this war continue. It looks like it's all but over, right? It's all over with shouting, or as Churchill said, right? If it's not the end, it's the beginning of the end. What does Lincoln show? The war actually is a divine mercy. If it were to stop at only 4 years duration, at only 700,000, it would be short of what God's justice would demand. And therefore, if God can afford to have mercy on those who are spared, those who survive this cataclysm, surely Confederates can be charitable towards Unionists, whites towards blacks, blacks towards whites, north towards south. We can all afford. If God has been merciful to us, surely we can be merciful to one another.
And that phrasing is important. I'm glad you brought that up, Lucas. That phrasing is important, too, because of the use of the conditional. Here is a chief executive of the United States who has exercised more executive power in the White House than any of his predecessors, and far more than many of his critics think he ever should have tried to do. And yet, he is not making the decision. His use of the conditional, if we suppose, and what do we think, instead of saying, here is the answer, I know it, I'm the executive, I'm in charge, I'm president of the United States, he said, what do we think about this? Is it possible that that innate modesty, that absence of evident ego in his rhetoric is, I think, another key element to why contemporary politicians who do not necessarily reflect that, nevertheless admire the characteristic and cite him as someone they admire.
I will just offer one more take on the second inaugural, which is endlessly fascinating and deserves a program of its own if Susan Clifton is listening to our program. I think Lincoln is, in a way, desperately shifting responsibility for what he has wrought in terms of the sacrifice. I don't think he can quite sell the case that 750,000 people and 4 years of war and treasure sunk is something we can all agree we should have done, not in the white majority that's listening to this speech. We actually had a huge African-American crowd listening to this speech. I think he's just desperately hoping that God is his ally in this and he has said in private ruminations, the will of God prevails. I don't want to spend too much time on this. By the way, I searched in vain when I wrote my book on Lincoln and the press for sophisticated analyses in the press of the day about this speech. Almost to an editor in New York, Democratic and Republican, they all were offended by that third paragraph. They didn't even mention malice toward none. They said, this is going to be a rough time. Haman will be hanging in the streets. Two people used that, Greeley and Bennett. They heard that third paragraph. So Lincoln, who is now celebrated as the man who said, with malice toward none, as an example of how to end the war, was anticipatorily being feared as a vengeful post-war president. So we have added our layers of understanding and interpreted his intent. Craig raised something that was right here in the cards that guide me to my spontaneity as the next subject that I wanted to cover, because there are so many issues unfolding as we sit here that relate to the Lincoln era that we're all confronting now. And there is a huge debate about executive power. Let's not talk about the Supreme Court yet, but there is a Supreme Court case on executive power. And Lincoln, of course, calls for troops without asking Congress, orders a blockade of southern ports. And let's just talk about that at the beginning of a war. By the way, we also have a war resolution on the table in Congress, which is not being acted upon. Peculiar. What have we learned and not learned about executive power from Lincoln?
Well, it's interesting. There is, I suppose, I hope that a lot of the people in this audience and those who may be watching online have seen the movie Lincoln, where Daniel Day-Lewis really channels Lincoln beautifully, I think, except, in my personal opinion, for the one scene in which his voice rises to a crescendo and he says, "I am the President of the United States, endowed with enormous power." I always thought, when I read that visually, that Lincoln was perhaps being ironic when he said that. I don't think he was asserting his power so much as he was saying, this enormous power I supposedly have, I must try to use, because he knew he had to work through an existing system. And yet, everything up to that was completely unprecedented. There had never been a civil war. There had never been secession. There had never been circumstances in which, with Congress not in session, the nation literally, not figuratively, not virtually, but literally broke apart. So action was needed immediately, and he was strong enough to take it and exercise it. I don't think necessarily because he felt like he had enormous powers, but because the circumstances, the context that was handed to him required him to do that. I think he did it out of compulsion, not out of a feeling that this is the way I'm going to exercise my power. I'd love to hear what others think about that.
Well, just in defense of Tony Kushner and Steven Spielberg, that line, "clothed in enormous power," is from the literature.
Yeah.
But,
Oh, yeah.
But your twist is interesting. Why didn't you say that when I was advising on the movie? Could have suggested that Daniel Day-Lewis do it differently. But executive power.
What I like about Lincoln in his use of executive power, especially the most controversial things he did, is knowing that they were controversial, he directed the nation's attention to the source of his authority. And to that extent, whether you think Lincoln was a benign dictator or some today would say is a tyrant just through and through, he at least directed the nation's attention to the standard by which he thought he, as a delegated exerciser of the nation's political power, the authority of that power, which was the Constitution. So, for example, when he calls Congress back into session, on
Which he didn't
of all
do
dates.
until July.
Well, there's a reason. We can get into that. Some of the states still didn't have congressional representation, so they had to wait for that, and they didn't have planes. So these things take
But
time.
they didn't have covered wagons either.
Yeah, okay.
But it's yeah.
So
we should talk.
but he assumes office March 4th. He doesn't. The war is afoot mid-April. He calls them back into session. Not at the end of April. Not in May. Not in June. But day of all days, July 4th, 1861. On that day, when he sends over his speech, he doesn't even deliver it in person. He sends it over, as tradition was, for a clerk to read. He takes the nation through the events since he's been inaugurated, and then from the least controversial to the most controversial, paragraph by paragraph, line by line, and directing them to his authority as president, and then the authority he exercised on behalf of Congress, presuming his duty and the exigencies of the moment required him to exercise these powers that he thought Congress would do. They would, if attacked, wouldn't they raise an army? Yes. Okay, so let's raise an army. I can't wait for them to show up to do that. All the way up until, of course, the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. He does all this in a way to educate the public in terms of how he is using the authority they gave him. And if they think he is abusing that authority, they can use that same document, the Constitution, and look for ways in which to restrain the exercise of that authority. 75,000, his nemesis Stephen Douglas says, 75,000? Try 300,000. Not enough. So he, as an executive, is operating within a spectrum of either doing too much or doing too little, and he shows the nation that spectrum and then says, this is what I have decided, this is what I have done, and let the public be the judge
Just
of
as
that.
an interesting footnote to that, the 75,000 figure, two of his advisors, one suggested 50,000, one suggested 100,000. Okay, 75. So in a way, that kind of fits the template
Compromise.
you're suggesting.
Well, we'll
yeah.
get to compromise. But Martha, isn't some of, I mean, in the afterglow of Lincoln's passing and martyrdom, the Supreme Court issues some rulings that suggest that he overreached. So now, I mean, say what you were going to say, but maybe you can address that as well.
What I found so interesting in reading personal responses to the assassination, so I read many, many letters and many, many diaries, the Confederate side was so interesting. So many of the Confederates felt quite gleeful at Lincoln's assassination, and some of them expressed that in public, but many of them only in private. And the kinds of words that were used to describe Lincoln speaks in an interesting way to this question of executive power. So first, he was often called a buffoon. That was kind of his rural upbringing, or the mention of that.
Or his jokester.
Jokester. Also, he was
Personality.
constantly called in Confederate diaries and letters an ape, and I think that has racial overtones. He was called a monster, and he was called a tyrant, constantly called a tyrant. Now, some of that, I think, is about all of the issues of executive power that you brought up, Craig. But it's also really directly about the end of slavery. Absolutely. Whereas Lincoln's abolitionist critics on the other side didn't think he was going far enough and thought he was going much too slowly and were extremely irritated with him. But from the side of the slaveholders, it was absolutely an overreach of executive power.
And the press up very close to the time of his death, the Northern press was still the Democratic press was still assailing him using the T word. He was a dictator. He was a tyrant.
Yep.
And it's about the time that John Wilkes Booth begins talking about him as a Caesar and identifying himself as the Brutus who will avenge him. I always thought he was more like Antony because he wanted to make speeches and eulogies at the same time. But it's so, okay, so getting back to our theme of why Lincoln matters and just rounding out this part of the discussion, can everyone on all sides of the political spectrum then claim that they understand Lincoln's emergency uses of executive power, his rationale for executive power, his post facto calling of Congress for whatever reason? How does it resonate today? Because it seems to me that it's not one size fits all, but it's being used thusly.
Well, I don't think, I'll put it this way, I think there's a large element of the modern political spectrum that admires Lincoln not because he used a lot of executive authority. That would be something they would find, this particular group, unnamed, would find objectionable about him. But it's the other aspect, the high language, the beautiful language from the King James Bible and from Shakespeare that he crafted so beautifully for the country, the martyrdom, dying at the exact moment of triumph. I always tell my students, this will make you immortal, but it's not a good, business model. But it did play an important role, I think, in the apotheosis of Lincoln's subsequent reputation in American society. So back to the idea of selecting those aspects of Lincoln that you particularly admire. I don't think necessarily that everyone says, oh, we admire him because he was a strong executive who used executive power. Right. That would be a part they would kind of put on the back shelf. This group would say, I admire his language and his foresight and so forth. So it's not one size fits all at all, I don't think. So people are modeling Lincoln to fit the image.
I mean, Nixon did it, Johnson did it in the Vietnam era to justify executive leadership without specific congressional consent.
One of the things that's so amazing about Lincoln at the moment of his death is, first of all, I thought the image of Lincoln as the best friend of the white South was something that came with the era of the early, or I should say the second Ku Klux Klan, when Birth of a Nation in 1913.
16, I think.
In any case, in the 19-teens.
This is the centennial of the movie.
Right. So if you've seen the movie Birth of a Nation, which is a horribly racist depiction, obviously, of Reconstruction, one of the placards, it's a silent film, but one of the placards calls Lincoln the best friend of they say, of the South. They mean the white South. What I found that was so amazing in these personal sources was that the day he died, April 15th, 1865, people were already calling him, the same white Southerners who were calling him a monster, a buffoon, an ape, and a tyrant, were saying he was their best friend. And of course, African Americans also claimed Lincoln as their best friend. So there's something quite genius about that. And there's something about that I think modern politicians would like to claim. But one of the big differences I find between what we see on the political scene right now and Lincoln made a lot of people angry on both sides. He wasn't afraid to make people angry, but the difference was, because making people angry seems to be one of the major forces driving the election campaign right now, the difference is that Lincoln listened to the people who were angry with him and changed his mind and changed his strategies and his tactics as time went on in a way that's really quite remarkable. And that's where I wish he would be a model for current day politicians.
That's a good point.
I suspect he changed his tactics more than he changed his mind. I've always believed that he had a pretty clear goal in the distance, but that the course that he would take to get that was open to circumstance and all sorts of things. So I think that tactical modification is absolutely, but in terms of the final goals, I think probably fairly. What did he say about don't give way on the idea of expanding slavery into the West? Hold as if with
a chain of steel.
A
chain of steel.
As if with a chain
Yeah,
of
and
steel.
so that element of it would hold, even if the tactics would shift.
I would only add in terms of folks selective. I do think they choose from Lincoln the things that make their case. In the same way Supreme Court justices choose the Federalist Papers when it helps them. Because the Federalist Papers have this great, and I think deserved, reputation as having the authority on what the Constitution means. The Supreme Court will cite it when it helps them and ignore it when it doesn't. So the same thing with Lincoln.
Just one more further drilling down on executive power, because it's important. And I'm going to use Craig's Spielberg entry point here. In one of Lincoln's, Daniel Day-Lewis's monologues, he walks through his alleged rationale for pursuing lame duck congressional approval of the 13th Amendment, and that's his uncertainty that the Emancipation Proclamation could survive peacetime judicial review, legislative review. So I think we should discuss, again, this ingenious model he created and crafted with some deceptive political and public relations activities as well for his most important executive decision, and that's the Emancipation Proclamation. Lucas, why don't you start?
Yeah, as Martha referred earlier, there was a good portion of the population that thought Lincoln should have, at the stroke of a pen, right, as soon as he became president, or at least as soon as the war began, used the military context as a way to emancipate slaves. My reading of Lincoln and teaching of Lincoln these many years leads me to believe that he was not what some refer to as a reluctant emancipator. That, good grief, the guy who could write the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural, and you turn to the Emancipation Proclamation, either the September 22nd preliminary or the January 1, 1863 one, so boring, so, Hofstadter's phrase, had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. In other words, the list of goods that a ship or a truck today would contain. Lincoln's heart wasn't in it. I think, and several others have made this point, I think it showed precisely the opposite. That if emancipation was going to come, it had to come in a way that would stick. He couldn't just free the slaves. He had to free them in a way where their freedom would be secure from a court challenge, a legislative challenge, either at the federal or especially at the state level once the war is over. And so Lincoln, it was, yes, all of that boring legalese that he drew up from his own experience, precisely because the thing had to stick. That's how serious he took it. That's how serious he took the rule of law, which protects anybody's rights. What good is it to free someone if, as soon as they are away from their chains, they could quickly be thrown back to their former masters? So I think the Emancipation Proclamation and what he did leading up to it, most famously or infamously the letter to Horace Greeley in August, were ways to prepare the country for something he knew would not be popular with some people. Just a quick note here. It wasn't just Southerners, it wasn't just Copperheads. Benjamin Curtis, one of the two dissenters in the most infamous Supreme Court case in our history, Dred Scott v. good grief, I'm blanking, Dred Scott v. Sanford, thank you. In that 1857 case, Benjamin Curtis from New England, that was his swan song. He left the court after that because he did not think he could work with Chief Justice Taney anymore. What does he do after Lincoln emancipates the slaves? After Lincoln suspends the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, he publishes a fairly lengthy pamphlet called Executive Power, excoriating Lincoln for using or abusing his presidential authority on the things, at least with emancipation, you would think this is a slam dunk. He took issue with that.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Martha.
Just a few thoughts. I agree with everything you said about the Emancipation Proclamation. And you can read the proclamation easily as a document that doesn't technically free any slaves, because Lincoln is writing about the areas in which there is no Union occupation. So it doesn't pertain to slaves who are in areas that are not occupied by the Union. But of course, what that meant was that every time the Union Army came through, it became a means of emancipation. Now, a number of people at the time made very interesting comments about the Emancipation Proclamation. I think this was Frederick Douglass, but correct me if anybody knows otherwise, who said that when Mr. Lincoln issued this proclamation, the truth was that slaves had already taken their own freedom. And so what you said makes perfect sense, that he needed to make that legally work in a way so that those slaves would not be re-enslaved. But the other phrase I wanted to say quickly was the response of the governor of Massachusetts, who called the Emancipation Proclamation a poor document, but a mighty act. Right. And that makes perfect sense and speaks so much to what you're saying.
By the way, Douglas celebrated the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary one.
Yes, he did.
And I'll just take a little issue with it affected only those people over whom he had no power.
Well, if you read the
army
document,
is on the
literally,
march,
yes,
and of course he
right.
had no power to.
Correct.
There he drew the
That's
line.
right. That's right.
Which is an interesting constitutional moment. I don't have the authority to liberate anyone in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, or Delaware. The first two, maybe he could have, but Maryland and Delaware are in the Union. Let's talk about compensated emancipation, which they don't want to talk about,
Right.
missing an enormous opportunity. So I think it's, what I find extraordinary here, and I wonder if any president could get away with this today, with the scrutiny and the 24-hour media that we have, not only the letter to Greeley, which is such a contrivance, and my paramount object is to save the Union. What I do about slavery, I do to save the Union, but he's already written the proclamation. He knows exactly what he's going to do. It's one of the great disingenuous moments with brilliant writing again. But he also, in one of the most disturbing good news, bad news moments, I think in White House history, invites the first African-American delegation to the White House and walks into the room with an Associated Press reporter at his side and says, welcome, I don't even think he says welcome, but you're the cause of the war. If you were not here among us, white men would not be cutting each other's throats. And Frederick Douglass goes crazy when he
wasn't invited.
He says,
Right.
Mr. Lincoln is using the words of a slave catcher. And of course, he goes on to talk about voluntary emigration and colonization. Mr. Lincoln is using the words of a slave catcher. Slaves are not the cause of the war. Slavery is the cause of the war. But all the while, he's doing what modern presidents do brilliantly on Twitter, or candidates. They know different means to do the same thing. Disinformation, we call it. He's telling white America, I will move 4 million people overseas. Sound familiar? I mean, it's a very strange moment in Lincoln's career. And frankly, it's probably the one incident that injures his reputation the most in modern African-American
most interesting point,
Circles.
your beginning point was so fascinating because you're absolutely right. The
You
way
didn't like
Lincoln,
the ending point. Well,
Well, no, I wanted to come in and
everything.
say we were talking about executive power, and Lincoln wrote the proclamation so that he couldn't be accused of overreaching, although in so many other ways he did.
Well, one of the interesting things about the whole emancipation, and there's a whole historiography about emancipation, we have to be careful to make sure we separate the moments in that trajectory, because the circumstances and the context change so dramatically in that trajectory. There's a famous quotation, which I'll probably muff here, which is that I cannot claim to have controlled history, but freely confess that history has controlled me. In other words,
I have not controlled events. Events
have controlled me. Well, I talk about history because
I know you're
I'm
trying.
a historian. I can't help it. And what I think he meant by that is things that he could do in 1863 and did do in 1864 would have been impossible, were impossible in 1861 and 1862. It was essential in 1862 to salve the concerns of Northern whites that any kind of emancipation, even limited emancipation, would lead to an influx of former slaves into their towns, taking the jobs away from them, upsetting their social environment and so on. And so this was necessary. It was less necessary later. So when we look at Lincoln and
maybe it was less
emancipation,
necessary than he thought at the time.
And I think that I agree with Martha. He was, and I think maybe Lucas said this, that he's not one of those people that, as some have suggested, he was forced into emancipation because he needed black bodies in the army and it was a way to keep his coalition together and so on. Rather, history and events gave him the opportunity to do what he had from the beginning of his earliest sensitivity to political issues wanted to do. I don't think in 1860 when he ran for president it ever crossed his mind that it would be possible for him as president to abolish slavery. But the war gave him that opportunity, and he took it.
But remember, his inauguration address, when there is no war, even though there are citizens of 7 states who don't think they're American anymore, they're part of the Confederacy, Lincoln says that he doesn't have the power or the personal inclination to touch slavery where it exists. That's his, again, calling attention to what authority he has as president.
One of the greatest ironies of the whole Civil War era is, of course, this debate, which Lincoln said he would support a 13th Amendment to the Constitution
in that same speech,
that would guarantee the permanent existence of slavery in those states where it existed, and it would be an unamendable amendment, whether the constitutionality of which is questionable, but that so that it could never be changed. He was willing to sign on to that.
He did. He sent it to the states.
Sent it to the states.
With cover letters.
Because he was convinced that if he prevented its extension, which was his primary goal, that it would eventually die out on its own. Well, eventually it turned out to be 1863. So, you know, who knew?
I'll add something on the Greeley letter. My paramount object, is not to save or to destroy slavery, but it's to preserve the Union. I mean, he says that over and over in that letter. Why? But the backdrop, of course, is certain abolitionists, like, for example, the most famous one, William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator, I shall be heard. These are guys who are saying in the Latin, which I don't know, so I'll say it in the English, let justice be done though the heavens fall. In other words, Constitution be damned. We don't care how it's done. Slavery should be gotten rid of yesterday. And Lincoln says that kind of attitude does not produce freedom for the emancipated. We have to find a constitutional means to achieve that humanitarian end, right? Which is why there's only one line about the justice of emancipation in the Emancipation Proclamation, which wasn't even his. So it was Salmon Chase who suggested it. Lincoln wanted that thing to be constitutionally just shut tight so that it could be as impervious as he could make it, impervious to challenge. He did not want to wax eloquent and purple prose to say, well, I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. No, the American people said, you can only do the right thing if we've given you the power to do that right thing, and that power is spelled out in the Constitution. So that I think really infuses that letter.
And I think at a certain point, he sees the whole path. He sees the efficacy and the promise of the military order. He sees the opportunity for constitutional change. He sees the opportunity for the Maryland state legislature to abolish slavery. I mean, his vision is extraordinary, but he still is a president who communicates half a thought when he wants to. And we extract half a thought when we want to, because they're so good, first of all. When he says events have controlled me, which is very often quoted, I have not controlled it. David Donald made it the epigraph of his book, and little inside story, he wanted to call his book, Events Have Controlled Me, which is not, Lincoln is much better. Lincoln is writing that letter to a governor who is saying to him, why are you sending black troops here? It's upsetting people, and I don't want to raise black troops. I don't want to see black people with guns. And Lincoln says, I haven't controlled events. Events have controlled me. We need, it's just brilliant. It's just brilliant. And so let me get to another issue. This is we could do breakout sessions on all of these things. So in the middle of a presidential campaign in 1864, when Lincoln was a candidate, not just a president, but also a candidate for re-election, the most conservative jurist of the 19th century, maybe, or certainly in the decisions he wrote, dies. People never thought he would never die, but he died. And Lincoln appointed a successor. Now, without being political, because he promised we weren't going to be, and in the midst of a civil war, he appoints an abolitionist to tilt the court. Not that the court has been doing much during the Civil War, which is another story. But so what does that tell us or teach us, or should we just say, another century, another situation, it's not applicable?
Both of those, I suspect. I mean, number one, there is a compelling analogy in that not only it was the last year of Lincoln's first term as president to begin with, and the fellow he nominates is Samuel P. Chase, who was certainly a Republican, but a Republican, I guess you would say, I don't know, right or left in those days, but he was a stalwart advocate of a more swift emancipation and a more open declaration of black civil rights, we would call them today. But also it was a different time, because in those days he had a friendly Congress. I know there were people who argued with him and people who called him names and so forth. That the Confederates weren't there. They had left voluntarily. So the Congress that he has, the Senate that he has to confirm this, is remarkably friendly. In fact, when he appointed a Treasury Secretary the year before, Fessenden, he mentioned to a senator that he wanted Fessenden to be named to the Treasury Department. He ran over to the Senate, and they ratified it unanimously before Fessenden even knew he'd been nominated.
Right.
So the nomination of a Supreme Court justice at any time in Lincoln's term had Republican politics built into it in terms of the cabinet clash that Doris Kearns Goodwin talked about so eloquently in her gigantic book. Chase was the leading element of that sort of not anti-Lincoln, but more progressive than Lincoln coterie. So to appoint him solved two problems, but also he didn't have to worry about the ratification in the same way, and that because it was at a different time.
Because the red states, gray states,
the red states weren't there.
Right.
A thing to remember as well is when Lincoln becomes president, there are vacancies. There's a vacancy on the court that quickly becomes 3 vacancies.
Yeah.
He deliberately doesn't fill them.
Yeah.
The timing at that point was he's hoping, let's take it down about 1,000, let the better angels of our nature resume their place, and see if we can maybe even get a Southerner
Right, he believed in
appointed.
regional representation.
That's right, and that was the tradition at the time. That was the
for
custom.
the cabinet, for everything.
Yeah, so, here, if he wanted to rush in and stack the deck, he had plenty of opportunity early in the war to do so, and he chose not to. He really did, again, work with a very friendly Congress to do so.
I want to say something else about 1864 that you brought up, Harold, because this idea of the vision and Lincoln's vision being so far-reaching and seeing the end point is problematic because it depends on the contingencies of the battlefield.
Sure.
It depends on the fall of Atlanta. And that's the big counterfactual you always want to ask. What if Atlanta hadn't fallen? What would have happened in the election of 1864? And then this perfect vision that scholars have plotted out that leads to the end of slavery and the 3 Reconstruction Amendments. What would have happened to all of that if things had gone differently on the battlefield.
Well, I'll add something that, Lincoln engaged in the counterfactual. In July and August, he does not think he's going to be
That's
reelected.
Right. Exactly.
He meets separate occasions with two leading black political activists, Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany. And guess what they're talking about? Lincoln's non-reelection.
And he wrote, didn't he write and put in
The
drawer?
blind memorandum is a separate thing, but
Yeah.
for these guys,
Yeah.
what he wanted them to know is, he wanted to know, how can you help me get as many slaves across Union lines as possible? Because when, not if, when McClellan wins,
Right.
the Emancipation Proclamation on March 4th, 1865 goes out the window. It's a military order. He's the commander-in-chief. That order will not stand when he becomes president. What can we do, again, to make emancipation stick for as many former slaves as possible?
And Douglas writes an elaborate plan. Here's how many people you need for your army of African Americans who will go in with this mission, and here's how much you have to pay them. Here's the bounty per enslaved person. It is he is absolutely moving to, without knowing what the legal consequences will be and what McClellan will do with his abrogation. And Martha's absolutely right. It all depends on the battlefield in the end. And we don't know. We don't know what would happen. But we should talk about constitutional amendments a little bit, because we don't know what Lincoln would have thought about the 14th or 15th, but we know what he thought about the 13th. And do we think it's the current image of Lincoln fighting mightily and using money and using jobs is an appropriate image? Is that about where we think he was?
Well, in his last speech on April 11th, which he delivered from the White House balcony, and which infuriated John Wilkes Booth enough for him to plot the assassination, days later, in fact, the lines that infuriated Booth were Lincoln's lines about his hopes that African American men would be granted the vote. Now, it was a very qualified statement. What he said was, soldiers, men who have served our cause as soldiers, and the very intelligent, that's the phrase he used, among African Americans, which is very difficult to interpret. So that was his mild, I would interpret that as mild, statement about black suffrage, although other scholars have interpreted those words as more than mild. But he was only talking about Louisiana, although there is a sense that he wanted more than that. I would say, given everything that he said all through the war and from the start of the war, that he did want that vision to spread, and he was purposefully wording it in a way that was very palatable, and of course far too radical for Booth and his allies.
Who says that's the last speech he'll ever make?
That's the last speech he'll ever make. That is what.
This comes from his discussion with the acting governor of Louisiana. Louisiana is the first state to be occupied by Union troops, therefore the first state to consider what it might look like after it's been readmitted, assuming readmission is necessary.
Isn't it a new state constitution?
Yes.
With a new state constitution, which must, Lincoln tells them, abolish slavery and do a number of other things. But he writes a private letter to this governor, the name?
Michael
Thank you,
Hahn.
that's right. And says, for just a suggestion for you to consider, it's not a requirement, but you might consider making the elective ballot open to soldiers and the very intelligent and so on. Well, this is late 62. Just as he moved in terms of his view toward emancipation, I think he
62 or
would have
64?
moved.
Was that 62, that
It was
was?
late 62, that letter's first written. I think he would have moved further in the direction, and again, what do we have to base this on? Well, we base it on the whole body of his writing and his flexibility in leading to the goals that were practical, the things that you could do. Unlike William Lloyd Garrison, who said this ought to be done, hell or high water. This is possible. And what was possible in late 62 and early 63 was that some, perhaps soldiers, might be allowed the elective franchise. By 64, into Reconstruction, 66 and 67, might be a far larger group.
I want to, as we maybe tackle one more topic before we engage all of you, invite you to, if you have questions, to line up at these microphones that we have on either aisle. And we hope you have questions for us. And the first one is always the hardest, so somebody be brave. And we'll talk about a few more topics while you come forth with your questions. I want to talk about another issue that I've been talking about a little bit now. I've done some new research, and it's such a hot button issue again, and that's immigration. Lincoln had his opportunities to join regressive groups in the 1840s and 50s and disdained the anti-Catholicism and anti-foreigner beliefs of the know-nothings. I am just astonished by a line in his 1864 message to Congress. I've used it now in my new talk, and Lucas referred again to the fact that he's not delivering these speeches. By tradition, he's sending them up to be read by a clerk, and I've speculated, I wonder if in the clerk, they used to supposedly read them in a very droning way because mostly they were reading it because copies were printed, whether anybody noticed this extraordinary passage, which is, last year, we welcomed 190,000 new citizens, and if we can continue this war forever, I'm paraphrasing, because of the replenishment of new citizens. It's really a rather astonishing statement. I know you've all had a lot of family members and friends who died, but the good news is that we're replenishing the society and we don't have that many restrictions. Is that your interpretation of where he was? I mean, especially if the new immigrants are Germans and Republicans.
Well, I think there's two aspects to that. Yeah, well, I learned in a book I read recently, a wonderful book about Lincoln and the power of the press, that Lincoln actually owned German language newspapers. So
Right.
I think the idea that Germans and Irish in particular, which in the 1840s and 50s were the dominant groups, but immigrants in general replenished and reinvigorated American society. There was, after all, in 1863 and 64, a gigantic open frontier that was wide open. The Transcontinental Railroad was under construction or consideration. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862. All of these opportunities. So the idea of new immigrants was all to the good. This is a refreshing and a refilling. But I think it was also reminding Southerners, you're not going to wear us down. This is, we can do this as long as you want. So there's a little of that.
Well, I'm glad to see we have some folks lined up. Why don't you start? Tell us your name and ask away.
Hi, my name is Peter Olson. I'm curious about his source of motivation. So, it's often talked about how he ran for office so many times and lost the vast majority of those, and it's easy to say he's an ambitious person, but I'm curious, from what you know of reading his journals and letters and all of those things, was he trying to accomplish particular goods? Was he trying to disprove all of those who doubted him? Was it sort of rank ambition? What motivated Lincoln?
It's a good question because it's not popular today to be a career politician. Lincoln certainly was, but everyone
Harold,
should
you
not.
should
No,
start
that's your
that off.
question,
This is
Harold.
I
you.
should? All right.
Fair's fair.
I think he had a platform, a Whig platform originally that focused on what we call infrastructure improvements and other aspects of Henry Clay's American system. And he also had ambition, and he obviously had enough ego to think that he would make a difference in legislative settings. I think he would have been proud to say he was a career politician and that he believed in the process. He didn't believe in primaries. I don't think he would have liked primaries. He liked conventions. He didn't like caucuses. He didn't know about primaries. But he certainly mastered the process, participated in it, loved the fighting, the argumentation, the discussions with the public, the debates. He thrived in that milieu, and I don't think he was embarrassed.
Let me
about
follow
any
up on
of
that,
it.
Harold. I was going to make a caveat, but maybe it's not a caveat. Maybe you can correct me on this. That there was a moment, he did serve as one term as a congressman in Whit, and there were three
Right.
Whig/Republicans who had kind of agreed beforehand they would each take turns, so he did one term and then he was out and made room for his friend and so on. And in a way, he was out of politics until the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Right.
And that drew him back in.
Right.
My question to you would he have come back in anyway, even
I
without
think so.
that? Okay.
I think so. And I don't think another thing I've been speculating about, and I did in my press book, is how out he really was.
Yeah.
I mean, he did make a few speeches. He did
52.
funeral orations that were very political, and I think he was inching his way back.
Yeah.
He was aroused by, as he's put it,
Yeah.
whatever that means, by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he came back, roaring back into politics.
Yeah, one of those eulogies was to Henry Clay in 1852, and he famously said that Henry Clay was his beau ideal of a statesman, and Clay was a career politician.
Right.
The most famous
And a
line.
compromiser and all of that.
Yes, more than half this audience can recite the line about Lincoln's ambition, right? It was the little engine that knew no rest. That was William Herndon. If anybody knew Lincoln, it was William Herndon, his longtime law partner. Lincoln found out very early on that he was very good at politics, that it drew a lot of what he was good at, which Harold already mentioned. But it's also true that Lincoln, and he says this a number of times in discussing the trajectory politically of Stephen Douglas, his nemesis, and in terms of thinking about what are the causes to which politics can be put. And he brings up the example of Great Britain. And he says, isn't it wonderful that at some day in the not-so-distant future, I'm paraphrasing, Butcher Lincoln, where he says, we will remember William Wilberforce. We will remember the guys who mightily struggled year after year, decade after decade, to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire, and those who worked against it will be sunk, to never be known anymore. Lincoln wanted to leave this earth famous, no doubt. He wanted to leave his imprint, but only if he could attach, as it were, his tail, to a kite that had some meaning. In speaking of Clay, he said Clay loved his country because it was his country, but also because it was a free country, right? Lincoln would later say, right, that he wanted to, this is the Peoria Address of 54, where he talks about, for about 2 hours, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and rails against it. He says, if we can put this country back on its rails where slavery will be put on course of ultimate extinction, he says, we will not only have saved this country, but we will have so saved it and made it worthy of the saving. He was concerned that the country was becoming something he could not recognize. It was becoming un-American in reading The Black Man out of the Declaration of Independence, right? And so Lincoln, yes, ambitious, supremely so. Wanted to be famous, to be sure. Let's go back to the Lyceum.
And he died at the right time.
Yeah. The Lyceum address, he talks
Exactly the right
about
moment.
what
Well,
fame.
he warns against ambition.
He warns against it and finds in himself a way to defend the nation so that he could preserve it with the help of the American people from those towering geniuses.
Yes, sir.
Hi, John O'Brien with the Lincoln Group. I want to talk about the second inaugural, the collective guilt of the nation that he referred to for slavery.
Yes.
I'm not aware of any reaction to that. Was that something that I missed?
You mean reaction at the time?
Yes, all the Democrats and everybody else that weren't so keen on ending slavery anyway.
Right.
But I can't recall any reaction to him making this collective guilt association.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I mean, the press didn't get. You're right that there is an absence of comment on that in contemporary sources. Something that people didn't glom onto it from the opposition.
No, that's a great question because I also came across almost nothing that I can think of about those lines. It's something that we dwell on today.
Yeah.
But of all the thousands of diaries and letters and newspaper columns I read, I didn't see anything.
Well, that was a disappointing answer, but what can we do?
Sorry.
No meat on those bones. Yes.
Hi, my name is Paige Buchanan, and I wanted to ask, one of the things that we've talked a lot about here is the 1860s, and there have been a lot of really interesting things that have come out that remind us that politics hasn't changed very much. But talking about 2016 and why Lincoln is relevant today, one of the things that I think about, and I might be revealing my roots. I have Booth in my family history here. But if everyone can claim him in their own way, how is he really relevant today, other than as this American Eagle, George Washington figure, this top hat figure that we all see and we all know? What is his true relevance today if everyone can claim
That's a
him?
very good question, too. Who wants to start? That's a tough one.
Well, I'll start by referring to what I said, I think, in the very first remark, and that is he's a combination of idealism, of someone who has a clear vision of making the country worthy of the saving, but also a very practical way of getting there. And I think that's a combination that's remarkably rare at any time, and certainly rare today. We tend today, I think, to have an instinct, well, I'm absolutely right and my opponent is absolutely wrong. When was the last time you heard in a debate from either party, well, that's a good point. I'll think about that. And Lincoln did that kind of thing. I mean, he had a clear vision of what the country could be and where he believed it should go and could go and eventually would go. Here's the other thing. He thought in longer terms than the next day's headline or even the next reporting cycle. You know, when he talked about the elimination of slavery in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he talked about creating circumstances in which the economic powers, by limiting slavery to where it existed, the economic circumstances would create a time when slavery was no longer economically viable and it would go away. Well, when would that be? Well, 80 to 100 years. Who's the last, any candidates today who say, well, you know, here's a program that's going to come to fruition 100 years from now? Well, I suppose in climate change would be the only thing. But I think those are characteristics that make him worth remembering and make him someone worth our admiration today. So,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Martha.
I'm going to give a different kind of answer, although I think it maybe says some of the same things you're saying, Craig. I recently talked about my book, Morning Lincoln, to a group of 4th and 5th graders.
What was the title again?
It's a joke.
you have a cover?
It's okay. This is a group of 4th and 5th graders, you're sweet, at a New York City public school, very diverse group of students. And the teacher specifically asked me not to make Lincoln into a hero. They're doing a unit on the Civil War, and they wanted the students, the two teachers wanted the students to have a nuanced view of Lincoln. So I talked to the students, these were 9 and 10-year-olds, about colonization and about the way various African-American leaders responded to Lincoln. And then I talked about the Emancipation Proclamation, and then I talked about the assassination and the responses of African-Americans who found it to be an utter calamity that he had been assassinated. And then the students wrote letters to me. And there were two things in what I had said that the vast majority of these kids picked out. The first was they were utterly fascinated on Lincoln's views of colonization. They were so interested that he had started out, for whatever reason, saying this. And then the other incident that I had talked about that every one of these kids mentioned in their letters was a story I had told about a classroom in the South in which a teacher had come in and told the students that Lincoln had been assassinated. And this was a classroom of freed children, so former slaves. And one little girl had taken off her black bonnet and cut it into pieces and distributed it so that everybody could have a mourning badge. And the children had all cried. And the source for this was a letter that a teacher had written back to the American Missionary Association here in Washington. And the students were just mesmerized by the fact that these black children had cried and this little girl had cut up her bonnet and given it out. And so what that tells me is that Lincoln's complexity, not that he was a flawless hero, has the power to mesmerize young people who find themselves caring about politicians and politics and what people do during wartime and slavery and race in ways that are complicated, not a simple story of heroism. And that, to me, is about why Lincoln matters.
I like the heroic Lincoln. If I had 10-year-olds that I was teaching, and we homeschooled our kids, and they got this from Dad, honestly, I start with the easy things about Lincoln. And the easy things are the things I mentioned earlier. If all men are created equal, doesn't mean that we base our protection of rights on what we all share in common as human beings. It's not race-related, it's not sex, it's not any other way that we can slice up the American bologna. I think that part, you don't have to have, oh, we like this part of the Lincolnian elephant or this part of the Lincolnian elephant. That the central idea of this republic is what I think all Americans get about Lincoln and why and how he can still be relevant today.
I'll go back to Craig in a second, but I think the one part of the story, the one aspect of the perennial ability to inspire not only leaders but citizens, flaws notwithstanding, is the fact that Lincoln existed, that a person born into such grueling poverty with such limits on the possibility of his advancement was able through the mythical hard work, which he did, and the study and determination, overcome the restrictions that had been placed on him by circumstance, and moreover believe that other people had the inherent right to have the same opportunity if they worked as hard as he. I think that's a really important aspect that is not bound by political philosophy and is so basically and wonderfully and uniquely American that it deserves to be attached to Lincoln, and it should be inspiring to everybody. Should we go to this gentleman who's been waiting? Arms folded, that's a bad sign. No.
My name's Eric Michael. Thank you for this panel. This has been a really great evening. I had more of a general observation earlier this week that I wanted to maybe just get your thoughts on. We celebrated a holiday earlier this week, as we do every third Monday in February, and the official name of the holiday under federal law is Washington's birthday. It is not recognized, at least under federal law, as President's Day, and I tell people that, and they don't believe me sometimes when I tell them that.
I didn't even know that.
Yes, it's true.
Yeah, my question really is, do you find it peculiar that our greatest president, who preserved and saved the federal union, doesn't have his own federally recognized holiday? And does that subtly speak to Lincoln's power, that we've kind of, through our collective will, have shoehorned him into Washington's established holiday? It might just be convenient that their birthdays are so close and we naturally put them together, but does that...
Well, I just think there was always opposition to make, Southern opposition to making Lincoln's holiday a federal holiday, and it's unsustainable
Am I wrong? No,
today.
it was a federal holiday,
No,
and then
was-
they blended it. Is
It was?
that correct? Yeah. They took it
Well,
away.
New York always celebrated.
I also think it's interesting that Washington was a slaveholder, and that doesn't seem to be controversial. And I do think, I mean, it's true that there used to be Lincoln's birthday, but
Right.
I do think that Harold is right. There are I wouldn't say it's a large number of Americans, but there are a vocal minority of people who still loathe Abraham Lincoln.
Absolutely.
Loathe him.
Yeah. Absolutely.
He's still the tyrant.
By the way, I don't think I'm mistaken in saying that it's almost universally described as President's Day, as some amorphous, generic celebration, and that this year, at least under New York City's famous labor contracts, the perfect storm of a 4-day weekend forced us to focus on Lincoln on Friday and the whole weekend.
That's right.
Yes.
Hi, my name's David Smith. I'm from Great Britain, and I wonder if I could ask, did Abraham Lincoln have much interaction with Great Britain, and how did he view it, given all the history? And if I can ask a second question also, if he had not been assassinated and had served out his full term, do you think perhaps inevitably his reputation would have gone down? How would it all have ended? Would it have actually been harder for him to be such a legend?
Oh, two big questions. Well, the Great Britain one we can do. Who wants to do that?
Okay. His primary concern with Great Britain during the war, of course, was that Great Britain not become involved. That was the single most important thing. Again, misquoting him, I'm sure, we can perhaps fight the Confederacy, but we can't fight the Confederacy and Great Britain at the same time. So he did have relations, if that's the proper term, through his Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, with Great Britain. And I think a critical player in this was the British ambassador to the United States, who worked with Seward on big issues like the Trent affair in 1862, when an American warship stopped, boarded, and took two designated ministers, they were called then, ambassadors we would say now, to Great Britain and France, and really drew almost to the edge of war. Lincoln was determined. He was trapped here in a way, because to disavow the event would be extraordinarily unpopular politically in the United States, but to embrace it would have courted war with Great Britain and upset everything he was trying to accomplish. And the way he managed that, again, back to his delicacy, his ability to maneuver, his sense of nuance, allowed him to survive that. The only other thing I'll mention quickly is that I think that in this famous carriage ride that he and Mary Lincoln took on the afternoon of the day he was assassinated, supposedly one of the conversations they had was the traveling that they would do when he was no longer president, and the Holy Land was certainly up front there. He wanted to see that, but he wanted to go to Great Britain as well. Yeah. So those are the two things I might mention. There's a wonderful book by Amanda Foreman. What's the title?
A World on Fire.
World on Fire. Great big fat, but beautifully written, that you would enjoy. It talks a lot about that relationship.
He wrote a letter to the working men of Manchester.
There's a whole other relationship with the working man's movement, John Bright and all of those people who are really the backbone of the anti-slavery movement and the friendliness to the United States once Lincoln is congratulated in Great Britain for moving on emancipation. Their activism makes it very hard for the British government to recognize the Confederacy. It's not just Antietam, but it's the British reaction, it's the working man's movement. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He allegedly had an engraving of him in the White House, along with his Andrew Jackson painting. So he was very taken with him.
I'll say a quick word about the assassination question. What would have happened if he had lived out his term?
We have to deal with that big question.
There are two ways to answer that. The first is what you said, which would have been much more complex than being a martyr at the end of the war when there had just been Union victory, and it might well have tarnished his reputation. The other answer, I'm not saying I give either one of these, but the other answer is that, of course, Lincoln would have found a way, as he did all through the war, now I'm going to pick up where Harold started about Hillary Clinton saying that Reconstruction was too harsh. So when I'm saying there would have been a way to make Reconstruction less harsh, I'm talking about something quite different. I'm not talking about, I don't think that Reconstruction was too harsh on the Confederates. I think it's a fact that Reconstruction was filled with white violence toward African Americans. It was the birth of the Klan in 1866. So if the positive side would be Lincoln might have found a way to make Reconstruction less violent for African Americans and more permanent in the positive developments of Reconstruction. But we don't know which one that is, and we can never know.
Lucas, do you want to speculate as well?
Yeah. Hey, I'm not a historian. I can speculate all I want.
Yeah, exactly.
The historians always I don't engage in counterfactuals. They're wimps, cowards. Don't let them get off like that. They do their job for a living and get paid for it.
I talked about the Fall of Atlanta.
So, okay, fair enough. And fairly won. I would say this, I think his reputation would have been tarnished somewhat, especially in the eyes of a good number of Southern whites, because he would have had to engage in what they considered bayonet rule. He would have essentially been the forerunner of what Grant did when he was president. That's the closest thing I can come to as what would Reconstruction have looked like under Lincoln. And by the way, Lincoln didn't like that term. His preferred term was restoration, because Reconstruction implies destruction. It implies that the states actually did leave. And he never, in the great line of Lyndon Johnson, remember when he was walking to the wrong helicopter, Air Force One, and the military guys didn't want to tell big old Lyndon Johnson that he was going to the wrong plane, and finally says, Mr. President, that's not your plane. And Lyndon Johnson, without batting an eyelash, says, boy, them's all my planes. For Lincoln, maybe not clothed in immense power, but them's all my states, right? He did grow up in Kentucky. So Lincoln never considered the states out of the Union and said, look, talking out loud about that really doesn't help. The Reconstruction speech he gives, he's like, let's not worry.
Although his policies belied
to
that.
To be sure. But he's like, oh yeah, there are exceptions by, necessity forces them.
And he does use in all fairness, he does use the
term
word Reconstruction.
But he uses the term. It's the locution, in the same way that Civil War, which is a massive misnomer when you think about it, that's part of the locution. It's the War of the Rebellion, right? it isn't a true civil war. If the South had won, they would have been an independent nation. They weren't going to take over the country, so it's a misnomer, but it's in the locution. So, but my point is, Lincoln would have, his reputation would have suffered to some extent because he would have had to have federal troops occupy in order to put teeth, to the extent that the federal government can put teeth into restoration, restoring federal authority over the citizens of the Union.
I just want to, I'll weigh in with my view, which is that I think I'm more in the Martha Hodges camp here. I think he was so skillful.
I didn't take a side.
She was explicit about that. She was explicit
Martha
about that.
Hodges, Part A.
Yes.
That's right, you
actually
offered a
pretty cool.
choice. I stopped listening after A. I like
know,
A.
I know.
The idea that he finds a path, the idea that there were so many great words unspoken that he might have used. My own view is, since we can say pretty much what we want here, is that Reconstruction, civil rights would have been pursued on a slower path, but a more permanent path. And that's just a hunch. I have a terrible piece of news, which is that I have to cut off the questions. And we have a little bit more to go in the program, so don't leave. And there's more excitement to come. And of course, a book signing to which you're all not only invited, but I think we're going to be locking the doors from the outside. So can't leave unless you have at least one of our books with you. I just want to end with two quotes that I thought would be useful for the conclusion of our discussion. And one is from Hillary Clinton, who we talked about several times tonight. And when she thought about it, she said this: "What I meant was," no, she didn't say that. She said, "We might have gotten to a better place during Reconstruction under Lincoln's leadership. What we needed was equality, justice, and reconciliation. Too many injustices remain today. Attempts to suppress voting rights go back to racist efforts against Reconstruction, and in fighting for voting rights and equality today, we are continuing a long struggle that still has to be fought and won in our own generation." And that may be a pretty good way to get out of the predicament she was in. But as usual, the quote I want to end with before we introduce a guest to the stage is Lincoln's. He's always a good person to conclude with. "There are already among us those who, if the Union be preserved, will live to see it contain 250 millions. He was right about that, as he was right about so much. "The struggle of today is not altogether for today. It is for a vast future also. With the reliance on Providence all the more firm and earnest, let us proceed in the great task which events have devolved upon us." And they still do. Events. Just what Craig started with. So thank you for participating in the discussion.
Thank you.
And we thank Craig Symonds and Martha Hodges and Lucas Morel. But now I want to introduce the person who really inspired this discussion, the president of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, Karen Needles.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming and thank the National Archives so much for this wonderful partnership that we have. We would like to give a special gift to the speakers tonight. When I'm not focused on the presidential duties of the Lincoln Group of DC, I'm busy here at the archives digitizing the millions of records that Jim has been talking about. The Lincoln Archives Digital Project was launched in 2002. The website went active in 2006, and the Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation endorsed it in 2007. We are in the process of putting all executive, legislative, judicial, and military records that were created during the Lincoln administration online for your use. It's a public service project. It's www.lincolnarchives.us. No subscription. It is your documents, so enjoy them. So what we're giving our speakers tonight is one of the documents that I located. in Treasury records. This is an invoice from Appleton Company in 1861 with a list of books that Abraham Lincoln ordered for his White House library. This gives some insight into the types of books that Lincoln wanted to read. So here we have the invoice as well as the back of the invoice, which has Lincoln's signature on it. When I took this to Staples to get the reproduction copies made, the young man, after I got the reproduction, he handed them to me. I laid it down flat on the table, and I said, "Please tell me who signed this document." And the young man looked at me, and he said, "I can't read cursive." And I'm a former history teacher, okay? And so I literally pointed and read the entire thing to him. When I took this to Michael's to have it framed, I laid the documents down and once again asked the two girls in Michael's to tell me who had signed the document. They couldn't read cursive. And so once again I said, "Abraham Lincoln signed this document." And they said, "Get out of here." Where did you get this? And so anyway, we want to give the speakers something memorable, because we truly believe that Lincoln still matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Continue.
Thank you so much. Wonderful gift.
Not a bill of lading. Awesome.
No,
Yeah, how about that?
much
I think
better.
we're supposed to get right off the stage.
Oh, we.
All of you head upstairs.
Oh, group shot, wait.
Here we go.